one of our public attendees as well as online here. So
Perfect.
thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. I'm going to just give us another minute before we get started. I don't think we quite have enough for quorum. Oh, there's Councillor Miyashiro, so we have 3 now. Excellent. I don't see Councillor Kaufman yet, but he has a few minutes to join. I don't know if anybody else has noticed, but my team says everybody in different places now on my screen. So if I'm missing anybody, we'll get going. Welcome everybody to the Civic Works Standing Policy Committee for May 6th. We will be starting here in just a moment. We are going to begin with the call to order, and I'm going to start with the acknowledgement statement. The City of Lethbridge acknowledges that we are gathered on the lands of the Blackfoot people of the Canadian Plains and pays respect to the Blackfoot people past, present, and future, while recognizing and respecting their cultural heritage, beliefs, and relationship to the land. The City of Lethbridge is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. We'll begin, Mr. Westerson, with a roll call if you just want to let everyone know who's in this meeting and which councillors are here. Thank you.
Certainly. We'll start with the roll call. Councillor Kaufman.
Present.
Councillor Miyashiro.
Here.
Councillor Parker.
Here.
Acting Mayor Croson.
Present.
All of the members of SVC are present and accounted for. I do see online, I believe Councillor Higgin has joined us as well, as have many members of administration and a few members of the public here. You have some representatives of transportation, legal, transit, parks, as well as 2 representatives of different public entities with regards to presentation 4.1.
Excellent. Well, welcome everybody to the Standing Policy Committee. This is a little less formal than our council meetings, so we will be having presentations from staff on various subjects, and I understand as well we have some members of the public who'd like to speak on 4.1 as well. But to get the ball rolling, we'll start with our consent agenda, which has listed the minutes of our last meeting of April 1st, 2021, and the status of initiatives that have been brought forward. Are there any concerns about any of those coming from any members of the committee? If not, we will approve the consent agenda by consensus and move on to the adoption of the agenda. The agenda was circulated and then just updated and recirculated yesterday. So we have 4 items under the presentations with various subcategories under there. Are there any questions or concerns from members of the SPC about the agenda and the order of the agenda? We will adopt that as well by consensus then, which jumps us right into our first presentation on micromobility and e-scooters. And I believe, I'm not sure, Mr. Hawkins, if you want to start or if you want Mr. Sonnermont to just jump right in.
I'll let Adam jump right to it.
Okay, Adam, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. So micromobility. We've been approached by a couple of companies about potential opportunities to operate micromobility services here in Lethbridge, and just wanted to give you a little bit of a background about what micromobility is, and basically asking today, is it something that Lethbridge would be willing to get into? So if we go to the next slide. So micromobility is about providing services to move people on short trips using small lightweight vehicles that operate at relatively low speeds. Next slide. This is something that we're seeing in more and more cities around North America and the world. We've got a number of pilots that are either going on or wrapping up here in Alberta with Calgary and Edmonton. And we also see micromobility services popping up in other cities such as Windsor in Ontario, Ottawa, Victoria, and then in the States with places like Seattle, Portland, San Francisco. So it is coming about, and mostly in large marketplaces, but also a few medium-sized markets, more similar to Lethbridge in size. Next slide. Micromobility services would line up with many of the city's plans. So looking kind of at our council strategic plan, a lot of it having to do with, and municipal development plan and transportation master plan, a lot of it having to do with providing different options for getting around in Lethbridge. They also tend to be services that concentrate a lot on the downtown, so that'd be providing options for getting around downtown that are a little bit easier than either walking the full length of downtown or driving and parking again a few blocks away. So it has the potential to make it a little bit easier to get around in some of the places where there's a good concentration of destinations. We also, if we go to the next slide, there's also a few different opportunities. Kind of continuing on that point, we've got to think about whether we want micromobility here in Lethbridge. And as mentioned, it has that potential to replace some single occupancy vehicle trips. It's a good method of point-to-point transportation. So you get on at one spot, get off roughly where you want to end. There's no fixed schedule for it, so you're not standing around waiting for something to arrive. You go, you find a scooter or an e-bike, and you ride off to your destination. It's a mode of transportation where you're not sharing your vehicle. You hop in, you don't have to wait for someone else, you just go. It takes up less space than a car. You can fit a half dozen of these in the space it would take to fit one car into the right-of-way. And it's a decent last mile transit for Solutions. So you might hop on the bus somewhere in the city, come to the transit terminal downtown, and from there hop onto an e-scooter and head to your destination downtown. So there's definitely some opportunities with this type of technology to make it a little bit easier to give people that more options to really get around in the city. Next slide. So what is mobility as a service? This is often how micromobility gets looked at. So whether we're looking at e-scooters, e-bikes, any of these little devices that get people moving around on these short trips, usually what happens is there's a mobility as a service provider. So this would be a company that would come into town, provide a fleet of units to ride. These are sometimes docked units where there's a big metal rack of some type that holds their vehicles, or dockless where they essentially lock their tires and kind of just sit there until they're ready to be used. Someone comes up to the units with a smartphone, unlocks the unit, starts their charge time, their fare, and then again at the end of their trip they lock it back up with their smartphone. And that's generally really quick and short Coles Notes version of how this type of service works on the micromobility front. If we go to the next slide. So some of the best practices out there, we've been doing a little bit of review, trying to figure out what works well. So the usual best practice is to operate the micromobility device, whether it's e-scooter, e-bike, in the same place as bikes operate. There are a few different variations to this. Calgary's tried one where they're operating more so on the sidewalks. So there's a few different options, a few different models out there to really consider. And I think we'd probably work with the mobility as a service provider to really figure out what would suit Lethbridge best if ones were to come to town. And one of the big things is having rules about where they park. So one of the issues often is parking enforcement, and also figuring out where they can go. So there's a process or a technology called geofencing, where each one of the units that's available has a GPS referencing system, and you can sort of draw on a map the extents where something can operate, and when it goes outside there it slows down and stops because you've left the zone where these things can operate. So we can kind of limit or decide where we want these operating and where we don't want them operating. Next slide, please. So there are a few challenges, of course, with these, as we've seen coming out of many of the other municipalities. There's some challenges that sort of peak early on in the program and then sort of die off when the novelty of it comes out of play. So when it's something new, you might experience a lot of vandalism and theft in the initial deployment, but then as time goes on, that usually tends to peter off fairly quickly. Improper parking and sidewalk clutter are two that usually linger for quite a while longer, and those there would be working with providers to figure out how to best enforce good parking practices, and also a big part of education as well going with these is where to park them so that they're not blocking pedestrian routes or vehicle routes or anything. Next slide, please. Safety. So with this here type of service, there is a new conflict between some vulnerable road users, whether it's e-bikes or e-scooters, and the faster moving motor vehicles. It's a conflict that's out there. Calgary did a little bit of research on it. They didn't have any that resulted in any issues that resulted in fatalities or ICU admissions, but there were a number of collisions reported between these micromobility devices, whether it was between the devices and pedestrians or the devices and vehicles. So it is a potential issue out there, but it's something that, as there are more people out there using these devices and becoming more visible and generating awareness of these new conflicts, it's something that the community has the ability to adapt to over time. Next slide, please. So this here is just a really brief introduction to what micromobility is and a few of the challenges that we see around it. And what we're considering is to run a pilot. We started off with a competitive process, and then award to a provider, welcome them to come to Lethbridge, run a pilot here, evaluate the pilot and figure out some lessons learned and whether we need to make adjustments, and then come back to the SPC to present some findings. And that's it for the presentation. And yeah, happy to take questions when it's time.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I see Councillors Kaufman and Mearshiro, you have your hands up. Do you want to ask now, or do you want to have the two public presentations first and then ask your questions at the end? What is more convenient for both of you?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask. If it'd probably be better if we waited till the presentation from Bird and Lime before we delve too deep into it.
Okay, Councillor Kaufman, you concur? Okay, so we will go alphabetically by the name of the company. So Mr. Schaefer, we will start with Bird Canada, and we will switch it over to you for your short presentation. And just so you're aware, we try to keep our presentations about 5 minutes. We are kind if people go over, but not too kind.
I appreciate that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll begin if that's okay.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, committee members. My name is Chris Schaefer, and I'm Vice President of Government Affairs at Bird Canada. Next slide, please. As you may know, Bird Canada is a first and last kilometer e-scooter sharing company. We're also proud to be Canadian owned and operated. We have operated in Calgary for the last 2 years with the shared e-scooter program, similar to what staff are potentially envisioning here in Lethbridge as well. We've operated now in our 3rd season in Edmonton, in addition to other cities in Canada. I would say, understandably, right off the top, we're supportive of Lethbridge considering and allowing for a pilot for micromobility in your city. The beauty of a competitive procurement process in RFP is city staff in Lethbridge, Adam and others could really craft an RFP that really hits at all the items that the city is looking to address. And you'd basically be asking companies like Bird Canada and my friend at Lime and others potentially to apply to the city and share with you the ways in which we would envision addressing all of the concerns and issues that you may have with running a shared scooter program akin to what we do in Calgary and Edmonton. And then the city would have the benefit of evaluating us against those criteria. So I hope that gets endorsed today. Next slide, please. Just as quick headlines, you can see from around Canada, the Ottawa scooter pilot is very similar to the Edmonton and Calgary scooter pilot. And you can see here the chair of the Transportation Committee in Ottawa noting just how successful that pilot's been in Ottawa. And it's very similar to the pilot that exists for shared scooters in Edmonton and Calgary. Next slide, please. Touch briefly on some of the highlights from cities. Again, this is city staff reporting on their shared scooter programs. They noted in Calgary that 1 in 3 e-scooter trips replaced a trip by automobile, which is important for issues of greenhouse gas emissions and traffic congestion locally. And more than 50% of trips ended in a BIA or BRZ, Business Revitalization Zone, important during a pandemic in terms of local economic development. Next slide, please. Similar results in Edmonton, as you can see here, just in terms of the economic potential that a program of micromobility can bring to local economies. Next slide, please. This is the Ottawa staff report highlights, and I'll note in particular the economic impact. They found that quite a number of respondents to their survey in the city noted that when they rode an electric scooter, they did it for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but also providing an opportunity to spend money at restaurants and local businesses, and quite sizable sums of money, as you can see, upwards of $100 per visit. So again, during the pandemic, I think it's important to give people a means and way to move in and around their city that's not a personal car. Next slide, please. I'll touch briefly on aspects of the program. There's lots of education that we do as a provider. Again, the city could provide for this in their RFP. We do it anyways. These are public education sessions that we hold in cities and towns in which we operate, distribute helmets free of charge. We educate riders and the public on local rules, and we give them a chance to test ride the micromobility device. Next slide, please. Again, a bunch of in-app education. So in your smartphone, when you download the app, video tutorials, pop-up reminder messages that we can geofence to certain key areas of the city, just to really educate and remind people of the local rules to safely park and ride an e-scooter. Next slide, please. COVID protocols that we follow, obviously these are key for not only our in-warehouse operations, but also the disinfecting locally of the scooters in compliance with Alberta Health Services regulations. Next slide, please. So just some of the in-app messaging we do to educate on COVID protocols. Again, this could be a requirement in your RFP. We do it anyways. Next slide, please. Geofencing, again, this is something that the city, it really gives you control over where these devices are. We can have the scooters slow down and come to a complete stop safely in certain areas to keep them from being ridden in key areas, or perhaps it's a park where you don't want scooters ridden at all. We can cap the speed at whatever speed the city desires. It's generally 20 kilometers, but we can slow that down in key areas to a lower speed. And we can also create no park zones. The scooter won't be able to be parked in key areas either. Next slide, please. We have safe street patrols. These are uniformed staff that are, if there's a misparked scooter, we can address it quickly and promptly. We also are there to educate and inform local residents in real time about local rules. Next slide, please. And then I'll wrap up here because I'm probably getting close to my 5 minutes now. Again, the scooters are popular, so generally between 24 to 36 hours, they cycle back through the local warehouse for charging, but also they receive mechanical inspection before they're redeployed safely to the public. Next slide, please. Thank you for your time, and I do look forward to any questions that you may have for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schaefer. Mr. Hopkins from Lime Technology, the floor is now yours.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the committee. I'm Jonathan Hopkins, and I do government affairs for Lime. I'll start off by saying I get to work with Chris across the country on all of these different things. I'm going to talk to you about some of the things he didn't tell you about. Bird and Lime are the two largest providers in all of Canada. Lime's the largest provider in the world of micromobility services. Many of pretty much the different attributes or capabilities that Chris showed are common across the industry and between both of our companies. So mostly we're going to talk about how this can benefit Lethbridge. So next slide, please. Overall, this is a trend that is kind of shaping the world. About 200 cities across the world have micromobility in the form of e-scooters. In just 3 years, it's quickly overtaken bike share that had been in expansion for nearly 2 decades. Next slide, please. In the comparison with bike share, scooters and bikes do many of the same things, the same trip purposes to get people around. So that can offer a lot of benefits to the community. Next slide, please. The one difference is the cost. So bike shares on average across North America require 55% subsidy from a municipality or a local sponsor. Scooters, because ridership is higher and because they have less moving parts to get fixed all the time, are able to operate at a sustainable model in partnership with the city without requiring any city revenue. In fact, we pay the city the cost to operate to cover administrative costs. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, adding scooters to Lethbridge would cause Lethbridge to join a fairly exclusive list of cities across the world, including all the capitals of the EU, a number of cities in Canada, and many more in the United States. And then 2 more slides. Putting a picture to what Chris mentioned before about BIAs. This is Ottawa, where our trips occurred, and the orange outlines you see are BIAs. Half of trips started or ended in a BIA. Next slide, please. Calgary, same picture, 55% of trips started or ended there. Edmonton also was 55%. Next slide, please. I think this is a really helpful set of stats to think about in an era where we're trying to help small businesses recover from COVID. We've seen about how many trips started in BIAs. At Lime, surveying a few different cities, we found that about 80% of riders say that when scooters are present, they visit local businesses more. These scooters give them their time back, and they make participating in the economy fun. Basically, everybody's been to a local business on a scooter. So that would make you think that this is good for business. Next slide. A recent Emory University study said basically what I just said, that when scooters are present, each scooter contributes about $920 US for every 6 months that's on the ground to the local economy, not paying to the scooter companies, but to local businesses. So that means for every 1,000 scooters on the ground, that's about $1 million going into the local economy every 6 months. Neither of us, I don't think, would be recommending 1,000 scooters necessarily for Lethbridge, but in the 200 to 500 range, that's $250,000 to $500,000 every 6 months. Next slide, please. So overall, this is a tool that can be a partnership tool for the community to help bring attraction to, cause people to visit things downtown. People will come into town to ride scooters for the first time, to aid connection between great spaces, cause a growth in foot traffic, and then promoting a vibrant community. Next slide. And that means that companies like that all of that stuff happens if we do nothing. So when we actually collaborate with the local community to help people participate in local events or to discover what's great locally, we can be an even further improved local asset. Again, this is all free to the community. Next, 2 more slides. This quote is from a Deloitte report on the future of micromobility. Basically said that these things, can be very valuable. It's up to cities to test them and see the value that they can get. So very much like Chris, we support the staff's recommendation, because next slide, as I mentioned, this would help Lethbridge join a pretty substantial list of cities. And then companies like ours serve, cities actually much smaller than Lethbridge as well, and provide these benefits. So with that, I am happy to turn it over to any questions.
Thank you all very much for your presentations. I think you've given us a lot to think about. Those who don't know, I choose my pictures based on what we're talking about. And my picture today is 4th Avenue and 6th Street in the 1940s with bike parking right on the corner. So certainly we've done this stuff before, though those have been private bikes. But we do have questions. I believe Councillor Miyashiro, your hand was up first originally, if you'd like to begin with your questions.
Great. Thank you, Chair. And thank you, gentlemen, for your both your presentations. I'm just going to ramble and ask questions, so cut me off when you feel free, so Councillor Kaufman can jump in. I've used bike shares before. A little leery personally about scooters, probably because I'd kill myself, but that's another point. So let me talk about the charging part. I know, Mr. Schaefer, you showed us a warehouse where the charging was happening in your own facility. Is that correct?
Through the chair, thank you for the question, Councillor. Correct. So we would, in cities and towns in which we operate, and we establish a local warehouse within the city or within the surrounding suburbs, if you like, or region, and we use that as a base. And that warehouse is where we would store the e-scooter, repair the e-scooter, and deploy from into the city. And that's the purpose of that warehouse for us.
Okay. Thank you. And Mr. Hawkins from Lime, the original term for juicing came from your company for the people that pick them up and charge them. Is that correct? You guys are the originators of the term juicing.
That's correct. Yeah. So we
do
actually
you-
offer cities the choice of whether they want a local warehouse and it be done in-house, or whether it can be used as a local economic incentive and giving people during eras like this, people might not be working as many hours. They can make a few dollars on the side. So we have school teachers taking summer vacations with their kids by making extra money beyond what they make.
Yeah, I saw an article that said it's like a higher level of can collecting.
We like to think it's
Tongue in cheek. I know, I'm just kidding. Tongue in cheek.
clean mobility options, but
Secondly, if you came to Lethbridge, would the plan be to focus more on the downtown initially, or around some of our more popular tourist areas? What would that be something you'd have to discuss with Mr. St. Amand, Mr. Hawkins, and the rest of the administration?
I think our goal is to achieve the city's vision and goals. So there is a tendency for trips to occur related to density. So where there's more people living or more jobs, there will be more trips. So a program that didn't serve downtown, for example, wouldn't be a good program. A lot of people want to go there. But we can also test and support other trip purposes, including connecting to people to transit and trying to solve transit deserts or other places where there's mobility and connectivity issues. So our goal is to serve the city's goals.
Can I add something, Councillor?
Yeah,
Is that
for
okay?
sure. For sure,
Thank
yeah.
you. Through Chair, and I agree with what my friend Jonathan said at Lime. The only thing I would add is, again, the staff here are recommending, if it's endorsed here, committee, an RFP. And in that RFP, it's really an opportunity for transportation staff locally in your city to put what they're looking for in the RFP. So they could, if they wanted to, specify an operational service area or service areas, and we would geofence that in our app, and the scooter wouldn't be able to leave that. Really, the beauty of an RFP is you can have a lot of control in terms of what you would like to see in a program.
Great, thank you. And Madam Chair, just one more question, if you don't mind. No, I probably just forgot what I was going to say.
Can we go to Councillor
No, it
Kaufman
was
and come
dock.
back to you?
Sorry, no, it was about docked versus undocked. I noticed the Bird presentation had docked scooters, and I know in other jurisdictions there's been issues of people leaving scooters on private property, and it actually has caused some problems for your companies. Can you just address that, docked versus undocked, please? Either one of you can start. Yeah.
Sorry, who's? I think you directed at you, Jonathan.
To both of you, actually.
Okay, I'll go after you, Jonathan. That's fine.
There's definitely trade-offs with docked and undocked systems. In high density areas, docking can make sense to help to provide some degree of order. However, one of the pieces of versatility of this sort of system is that people can ride a scooter home, for example. One of the downfalls of dock systems is that you're trying to take a 10-block trip and the nearest dock is 5 blocks away. And so we would never recommend a universally docked system for Lethbridge. If the city, and this is one of the beauties of the pilot, if the city wanted to test and a docking station or two, we can try that out in partnership with the city and then adapt over the course of the pilot or in year 2 should the pilot be extended from that. But this is really like this it's an experimentation opportunity with safety as a focus that we can do in partnership with the city.
Great, thank you. Mr. Schaefer?
Through you, Chair. Thank you. I would agree with what my friend Lime said. The only part I would add is cities across Canada, again, the beauty of a pilot is it's a pilot and you can test different things, and you could spell that out in an RFP as well. But where cities in Canada, where they've landed generally is the street furniture zone parking. So an RFP would be rewarded, and a company would, in Calgary or Edmonton or Ottawa, they occupy the street furniture zone of sidewalks. So where there's bike racks or newspaper boxes or light poles or benches, the scooters are stored there. They've supplemented that model with, again, under a pilot framework in each of these cities, supplemented it with what's known as designated parking. And that can be something as simple as a painted box on the sidewalk or on street. It could have bollards as well. There's other options that we do. For example, we put parking we call it preferred parking in the app. So if a rider is near a certain area where the city says, we'd really prefer them to be over here and park, if they're going to be in this area, we prefer them to park right here. We can put that in our app. Lime can do it as well, and direct people to use that parking spot with virtual or with not virtual. So it could have a painted box and we could direct them in app to that painted box, or there may not be a painted box. It could just be virtual and we can direct them to where to park. So there's bottom line, and I'll wrap up by saying, is in RFP, all of these items can be spelled out concretely, or the beauty of a pilot is you can test different options, as my friend Lime noted.
Great, and thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you to our guests. Just so you know, the younger members of the SBC don't ramble as much. I'm going to ask some direct questions and just alternate back and forth between you, starting with you, Mr. Schaefer, and then to Mr. Hopkins. How are these devices, or the locations where they're situated? How is it insuranced?
It's a good question, through Chair. So in every city in which we operate in, and the same would be for Lime, there's insurance requirements. So if we were awarded an RFP, let's say through this process, there would be a contract between the city and ourselves. Part of that contract would spell out the insurance requirements that exist, frankly, in all the cities in which we operate. A part of that requirement was we would have to show the requisite insurance certificate and documentation to the satisfaction of the risk and insurance department at your city to be able to operate. So there's definitely insurance in place.
Okay, thank you. Use of these devices, Mr. Hopkins, in the winter. Are these a year-round, or are they a spring, summer, fall?
They are year-round for Canadians that want to snowbird elsewhere. So typically they do come off the streets during the winter. Part of the pilot would be, so in Edmonton, when weather cleared, there were scooters on the ground in December. So they can come out during that period of time. I wouldn't suspect it to happen in Lethbridge in the middle of winter, so it'd mainly be a 7 to 9 month affair.
Okay, thank you. Full disclosure, our daughter utilizes them regularly in Edmonton, so I do certainly have a 4-page anecdotal report from her as to what goes on. Mr. Schaefer, on-road versus off-road, are these designed purely for smooth surfaces? Are they designed for shale pathways as well? And what's the capacity of them as an off-road vehicle? Not asking if they can be, asking if they are.
Through Chair, so as my friend noted, shared e-scooter programs exist in 150 or more cities now globally. And as you can imagine, in all of those cities, there's various infrastructure. So there's a lot of paved road, cement roads, different cobblestones in Europe, as you know, you've traveled, I'm sure you have. There's different levels and grades of pavement and surfaces that these ride on. The scooters that both Lime and Bird Canada use are robust devices. You might have seen one in Edmonton. They've got thick diameter tires and the robust vehicles for sharing. They can withstand and are designed for varied road surfaces. So it's not an issue.
Okay, thank you. And if I'll just one more, if I can, Madam Chair, on the law about. So just sort of related to that, it's more of a question of where we could potentially see these. And we've got, as you've noticed in the city of Lethbridge, we have very sensitive, well, in the photo on the screen, very sensitive ecosystem within the river valley. Is this the type of thing that we might see people attempting to use on the coulees? And maybe to that then is, how specific is the geofence? Could our coulee area, the coulees themselves, be a no drive zone?
So we can definitely geofence off, and the geofences are accurate, within a meter. So we can geofence off areas in partnership with the city. Definitely next to waterways, we tend to keep these away to some degree if it's in unobserved areas. So I think those are some key facts for us, but we can keep them out of the natural habitat areas based upon those. Like, somebody would have to carry it in for a kilometer, and that's most people are not up to that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll hop out and hop back in.
Thank you. Councillor Parker, you're next.
My questions have been asked. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And we do have two other members of council who have joined us. Councillor Higgin and Councillor Carlson have also joined. Councillor Higgin, you did have your hand up for a while and then you put it down. Was your question asked as well?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I just, Councillor Kaufman did ask about the insurance requirements, and so that was my question. Thank you.
Okay. And Councillor Carlson, is there any burning question that you have?
I'm good. Just enjoying the discussions. Thank you.
Okay. So all the hands are down. While Councillor Kaufman's is still up, I think his hand just remained up. Are there any further questions from members of the SPC? Okay, Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you again, gentlemen. The statement was made about helmet. Are helmets mandatory with these devices? I think we're back to you, Mr. Schaefer.
Through your chair, it's a good question. So it can vary by province in Alberta. If you're 18 years of age or older, as you know, for riding a cycle or a bicycle or a scooter, a helmet is actually not required at law. However, we in line would be the same. We always strongly encourage and recommend helmet use. We provide for free via our app. You can order a helmet. I think you pay for delivery, but you can order an app for free from us. We distribute them at public events as well that we host in your city, or would host if this went forward in your city. We also have various technological features. Again, these are akin to across e-scooter providers, where we have like a helmet selfie, where we encourage people with their smartphone after a ride to take a selfie of them wearing their helmet and tweet it out or put it on Instagram and social media. We can then provide credit to them as an encouragement. Again, try to facilitate a communication and dialogue and community around helmet use.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hopkins, do you go head to head with other service providers and other municipalities? And if so, are they generally at a different threshold? I'm assuming City of Lethbridge would be an exclusive, or are we a city of a size where you could actually potentially go head to head?
So I think, in Calgary, Bird and us, we duke it out quite ferociously, as you can tell. But, actually behind the scenes are very collaborative to make sure there's good partnership and serve the city, because if we're doing a bad job, nobody wins. That said, the average number of vendors for a city under 200,000 in North America is one. Okay. Just to preserve staff time and allow focused on just one partnership.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Sinema, if I could ask you just a couple of questions. Thanks very much for the work on this, Adam. Really appreciate it. It's quite exciting, actually, for the potential here in the city. So I think it was Mr. Hopkins that had addressed the issue of service area or service area provision. To this point, is the consideration or the recommendation going to be from staff that we sort of let's do the entire city and see what the movement is? Or are we looking at, it'll be downtown only, or it'll be university only, or it'll be college only? What's going through your mind or the mind of staff at the moment? You're muted.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So at the moment, the discussions are kind of leaning more towards selecting a vendor and then working with them to figure out what's going to work. These are private companies, and the idea is to be cost neutral to the city. So we do have to figure out what's going to work from the business perspective and work from the vendor to figure out where that initial focus place is, or whether it's the entire city to start with, and move forward from there. And whether that's starting small and then expanding if it shows that there's demand there, or whether that's starting big and then shrinking it down, or just starting and sticking with what we start. We'd have to work closely with the company. In general, it's better to start small and kind of expand outward, because it's easier to give something new to people than it is to take it away if we start big and go small. So the leaning is to start small, but we'd definitely work with the vendor to figure out what's going to work best for them to start with.
Okay, thank you. The term cost neutral, as a political scientist, I love that term because it has so many connotations to it. Cost neutral doesn't necessarily mean zero cost. So there are going to be costs you've identified some of them in terms of enforcement, staff time to monitor, evaluate the pilot, deal with some of the issues that may arise if we enter into full contract. Do you have and I did not see it, forgive me if you've got it in somewhere, but I did not see as to what an approximate cost, an annual cost is going to be on the city side of the ledger?
So it'll be something where we'd be essentially absorbing it, I believe, into a lot of the existing programs and staff time. That's
Okay.
where most of it would be. So we'd be moving a little bit of time off to the side. But the idea is to, especially through the RFP process, is have the companies to a large degree self-enforce, especially when it comes to parking and moving units that are improperly parked or retrieving units from places where they shouldn't be. Having the company look after most of that to minimize the impacts to our enforcement services. A lot of it, the costs that we'd likely imply or absorb internally would be in the management of the relationship between the company and the city.
Okay, thank you. Madam Chair, I don't want to dominate. I've got more questions. I can hop out if there's others.
Well, I'm going to ask a question right now, so then I'll hand it back to you. Mr. Malcolm, I see you are online. I hope you're paying attention so I can ask you a question.
I am paying attention.
Thank you. It's always weird in this virtual stuff. This, of course, would affect the area that you do most of your work in, right? I'm thinking downtown Warehouse, 13th Street would be a prime place. Has there been any conversation about this with Heart of Our City or any of the businesses? Do you have any feedback at this point? Or would that be elicited if we go ahead with the pilot?
Yeah, so I haven't had specific conversations to say we have two companies knocking on our door and we're taking this to an SBC. What are your thoughts? But just through regular engagement, we have had the conversation over the last few years. I wouldn't go ahead to say that the Heart of Our City or an organization like the BRZ is in a position of submitting their support for it yet. But I think that would be a really key relationship to ensure is involved as we potentially went through an RFP and brought on one of these organizations and ensure that they have a voice throughout a pilot. Because I think certain items like, parking or being construed as being across a pedestrian sidewalk, or if they are allowed to ride on a sidewalk, whether that's endangering or making people feel uncomfortable on the sidewalk, all of those types of things, we would be looking for the BIA organization or those collective businesses to provide us information on. So long answer, but I think not specifically yet, but they would be a key piece going forward.
So what you're suggesting in my mind, I know that Mr. Senator Lamont has had, there will be public engagement in the pilot, but perhaps having public engagement setting up the pilot might be a better approach?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we were exploring the idea of putting out a survey in advance of this conversation or in advance of a pilot, and not to say that we landed there, but one of the things that we talked about was whether or not this is new enough or has enough exposure for people to be able to comment in advance of actually seeing it, and whether or not running a pilot and actually getting firsthand experience would be more advantageous for the purpose. And so I think we're still very much open to council's directive on that. That's kind of where we landed in advance of this presentation.
Okay, so how we have the conversation if we move ahead would be vital. Okay, Councillor Kaufman, those were my questions. If you have more, please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just sort of back to you on that, Mr. Malcolm, I do tend to agree that doing it is a better way than asking about it prior to anybody seeing it, especially on something different like this. I think you'll probably find a generational approach to it as well. Those who have been driving cars for decades versus those that are looking at alternative forms of mobility. So intuitively, I would tend to support let's do the pilot and be investigating the response to it afterwards as opposed to before. So my 2 cents, certainly for what it's worth. Mr. Sanama, just for confirmation, in terms of process, the idea would bring the suggested pilot in terms of rolling it out back to this SPC?
Can you clarify that question a bit? I kind of got lost in.
you'd be establishing the parameters for the RFP. Is that coming back to the SPC, or will it go to council?
I don't think we've gone too much into that detail. I had mostly, I believe the Envision would put together an RFP like we normally would, but if council or the SPC would like some more involvement in it, I could see that being a possibility. The potential hurdle might be getting an RFP together for SPC to review in a timely manner, as the last remaining meeting for this year is, or before the summer, is this one coming up in June.
Okay, thank you. I see Mr. Hawkins' hand went up on that.
Yeah, I don't believe it would be our intent let me back up, frame it in the positive. We would be looking for City Council's authority to proceed with a pilot. And that usually, and at the time that we seek that approval, when we're presenting essentially the essence of what it is that we're about to embark on, would be council's opportunity to influence what the RFP will ultimately look like. But we would not bring back the RFP to either SPC or to City Council. I think that would be, we don't think operationally that would be necessary, but again, if that's something that council and or the SPC is going to insist that they have a look at, that would be your call.
Okay, thank you. Back to you then, Mr. Sanama. What's the timeline? What's the hope to have the pilot up and running?
I believe the hope is to have the pilot up and running for this summer. If Andrew, do you remember if we were targeting potentially July?
Well, I think when we first started this conversation, yes, we were. Whether or not that timeline is still feasible would be something that we'd explore. I think probably as soon as possible would be the kind of the cop out on that one.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. And final question, if I can, Madam Chair. And this is something that's rattling around in my mind. I know that this can be flushed out through the RFP, but maybe both to Mr. Schaefer and Mr. Hopkins, we are both a functional and a structurally unique community. We've got physical separation between west side of the river and east side of the river. We have sort of nodes in terms of a university and college, so a different demographic there versus a downtown core, versus some of these other shopping nodes within. How do you see a pilot being able to test what goes on in a community like this? And I know that we're unique like every other municipality that you're in, but we're of course more unique. So I don't know if you can address that, but it's just, it sort of goes back to the question of how do you test everything with you know, in such a diverse place. And I see Councillor Miyashiro shaking his head, and I don't know if operational he's mouthing. So I'll leave that with you to ponder, and I'll step out of line. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Councillor Miyashiro.
Councillor Miyashiro, you're up.
I'll wait till we do our resolution at the end.
Okay. All right. So we are going to move on to the resolution since all the hands are down. The recommended resolution before us is to receive this as information and also to recommend to council that the city undertake a pilot. So that is the resolution that's on the floor. Of course, we can modify it as if necessary, or we can send it on as is. Then the other question that I would like to hear from my colleagues, if we do recommend this on to council, are we recommending it as part of consent agenda, submission, or presentation? So those are sort of the discussion points for members of the SPC at this time. Councillor Kaufman, your hand is back up related to this.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I actually didn't lower my hand.
Okay, Councillor Miyashiro.
Thank you. And I would like to add an amendment that the recommendation to council goes forward for the next council meeting.
You mean by the 18th?
Whatever the next council meeting is. So it has to hit whatever the next agenda review committee is.
Agenda review committee is meeting tomorrow at 10
okay,
because we have budget deliberations next week. So, Mr. Westerson and Mr. Hawkins, is that doable to have it in front of the Agenda Review Committee by tomorrow morning?
Yeah, and I would do, because we're looking at a pilot and not a full implementation, I think a submission would be fine. But my colleagues might differ in their opinion.
Okay, so you're suggesting we recommend it on, get it on by the 18th, so if a pilot goes ahead, we have time, and do it as a submission. Councillor Parker.
I was just going to say submission would be the most appropriate as well.
Okay. And you're suggesting we recommend it on, that you're fine with
Yeah,
sending
I'm fine with that. Yep, thank you.
Okay. Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I too would support submission. I'm assuming Mr. Sanamon would be available then to answer questions that come up from council.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Councillor Higgin, you don't get to vote, but you do get to have a say if you'd like to on whether you'd like to see it sent forward.
No, I am fine. Just sitting in here listening to what's going on. So thank you very much.
All right. So I think by consensus we have the motion to go ahead and recommend this to City Council to take it in as a submission and to work with administration to have it to agenda review by tomorrow morning at 10. Everyone's in favor with that?
Yes.
Excellent. So that moves ahead. Thank you everyone who was involved with that presentation. I appreciate everyone's attendance and coming. And you most definitely can stay on now as we move to our trees, as we now move to our urban forest management plan. The beautiful trees that the scooters would be under. So thank you all for that, and we shall move on to the next presentation, and that we turn it over to Mr. Ellis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll simply turn the time over to Mr. Hiroshi to do the presentation, and I'll be available to answer questions as needed.
Perfect.
Hi. So, thank you to the Civic Work Standing Policy Committee for the opportunity to present to you the 2021 to 2041 Urban Forest Management Plan. I have with me Mr. Don Nishikawa, Forestry Coordinator, and Mr. David Ellis, Parks and Cemeteries General Manager. I'm Hiroshi Okubo, Parks and Cemeteries Operations Manager. Next slide, please. The recommended action for the Urban Forest Management Plan for your consideration is to receive the Urban Forest Management Plan as a guiding document for the life of the document, and further to recommend to Council that the guiding principles, strategic goals and objectives, and recommended priorities contained in the plan be approved in principle and be used to provide guidance in the urban forest management. Next slide, please. The purpose of the Lethbridge's Urban Forest Management Plan is a comprehensive strategy to guide the management of the city's urban forest over the next 20 years and beyond. The management plan provides a roadmap to guide urban forestry policy, program development and implementation, resourcing, and priority setting. The two attached documents, first of which is the comprehensive plan, component of the management plan, is intended for use as a technical resource by city staff, decision makers needing detailed understanding of the current status of the urban forest management and the vision, principles, goals, objectives, and actions. The second document, entitled Lethbridge Urban Forest Management Plan, summarizes the comprehensive plan and is intended for use by the general public. The document can be referred to as the summary plan. Next slide, please. The vision is that the Lethbridge urban forestry is healthy, resilient, and growing. Trees along streets, in parks, and on private lands enhance the quality of life for all of the city's residents and are an important part of the city's identity. All community members support each other in caring for, preserving, and enhancing urban forests and the many valuable services it provides for the enjoyment and benefit of all. Next slide, please. Some context about our urban forests. With the exception of the pockets like the valleys and wetlands, there's generally no native trees in Lethbridge. Approximately 47,000 trees are on public lands with an estimated value of roughly $93.5 million. In the context of climate change, the urban forest removes over 4 tons of carbon per year, produces over 575 tons of oxygen per year. Trees in Lethbridge are estimated to store more than 13,000 tons of carbon, with an estimated value of $937,000. The social value of the forest helps make the city more livable. There are challenges of species composition and invasive pests. Next slide, please. There are 8 guiding principles. They are: 1, recognition. The urban forest must be recognized in municipal policies and practices as an essential infrastructure asset and should be considered as important to the livability of the city as any built infrastructure. Number 2, comprehensive approach. Sustainable urban forest management encompasses a wide range of decisions and actions that require coordination between multiple stakeholders. Number 3, adaptive management. Approaches to urban forest management should continue to be monitored and, if necessary, revised in meeting emerging needs and challenges, while striving to realize the established vision and achieve strategic goals and objectives. Number 4, local context. Urban forest management in Lethbridge should recognize the natural limitations to tree growth in the region. Number 5, adversity. A diverse urban forest is more resilient to a wide range of stressors and better able to continue providing important services than an urban forest with low structural, species, or functional diversity. Preservation. In most situations, preserving of existing trees is preferable to their removal or replacement or any other monetary compensation. Access. All Lethbridge's residents deserve an equal opportunity to access and benefit from urban forest services. Number 8, partnership. Realizing the plan's vision requires engaging residents and other stakeholders as partners in the urban forest management. Next slide, please. There are 5 strategic goals and objectives. The first strategic goal is to develop a better understanding of all aspects of the urban forest and its management, and use this knowledge to make better urban forest management decisions. The objectives are: increase knowledge about the urban forest, develop and implement an urban forest monitoring framework, enhance the utility of the urban forest knowledge and data. Next slide, please. The second goal is to improve the health, longevity, safety, and functional capacity of the urban forest and ensure that the future urban forest can reach its genetic potential to provide a full range of services in a safe and cost-effective way. The objectives being: maintain and enhance the functional capacity of existing trees through improved tree maintenance practices, reduce tree-related risk. Next slide, please. Enhance the city's ability to respond to existing and emergent pests, pathogens, and invasive species. Number 4, encourage community engagement in urban forest maintenance. And 5, obtain supplemental resources to support urban forest management. Next slide, please. The third goal is to expand the extent of the urban forest, strengthen its resilience against stressors, and enhance the capacity to provide functional services to the community. The objectives are: establish and pursue urban forest targets, establish more trees through development and capital projects. Next slide, please. Ensure all new trees are provided with adequate post-planting maintenance. Encourage community engagement in growing the urban forest. Next slide, please. The fourth goal is to protect existing trees and their growing environments against injury and destruction wherever possible, particularly during land development and land use change through a coordinated tree protection program. The objectives are: strengthen policies to better protect the urban forest, implement a comprehensive tree program, delay non-regulatory tools to encourage urban forest protection. Next slide, please. The fifth and final goal is to encourage all members of the community to engage in urban forest stewardship on both private and public lands, as well as build strong urban forest partnerships. The objectives being: develop an urban forest engagement program, strengthen existing and develop new urban forest partnerships. Next slide, please. The Lethbridge Urban Forest Management Plan, Action Plan, outlines 48 recommendations to be implemented within the 20-year planning horizon. The following are the highest and high priority actions. The highest are: develop a tree risk management policy, pursue additional program resourcing opportunities, support and monitor the enhanced tree watering program, promote post-planting care, tree care by residents, establish an interdepartmental urban forestry working group, prepare annual urban forest management reports. Next slide, please. The high priorities are: enhance tree inventory data quality, develop an emerald ash borer response management plan, enhance MDP policies to support urban forest protection, require a tree questionnaire for building permits and development applications, ensure circulation of urban forestry section on all applications with potential tree conflicts, collect full compensation for discretionary removal or injury of city-owned trees. Next slide, please. This concludes the presentation. I just want to mention that this slide is look from the water tower, looking southeast towards the exhibition grounds. Shows the vast canopy of the city of Lethbridge, which is the tree oasis, I guess, of Lethbridge in the prairie landscape. Myself, Mr. Ellis, and Mr. Nishikawa are here to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I can actually see my trees in that picture. So yeah, it's nice when my actual house is actually in one of the pictures being used. So we will open it up to conversation and question. Are there any members of the committee who have questions about this plan that's being presented? And I see one hand is up. Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Okubo, for the work and the presentation on this. I'm just trying to figure out where to start on this. If this is approved by council, and I would certainly hope that it would be, you've identified highest and high sort of priorities, and a person with many priorities is a person with no priorities. I'm going to assume the highest ones are short term and the high ones are short to medium term. Is that a good way of assessing the rollout of it?
I could probably defer to Mr. Ellis. He might be able to better respond to that.
This categorization is based on consultant recommendations, not necessarily our recommendations. We certainly concur with the recommendations. The order of them, I think, is something we'd probably look at as our ability to implement. So we'd probably start with low-hanging fruit, things that are important to us, and get started on those, and then work on the others. So some of the things that we would like to pursue fairly quickly is a municipal tree care kind of committee and have more general ownership of the trees corporate-wide. That's not too hard to implement. And so we'd look at things like that, kind of low-hanging fruit, I think, first.
Okay, thank you.
That's select from the top, kind of third.
Okay, thank you. I've obviously have sort of been harping on this from my perspective in terms of the preservation, protection. I think it's goal 4 when we talk about really sort of preserving the public trees that we can, and especially when there's an intersection with building and development, predominantly in the established areas where you have somebody trying to put in a driveway, an off-street entrance, things of that nature. I note that in the document on I believe it's page 28, it has reference to the fact that we do have some additional statutes in place, but we don't enforce them. Is that by choice? Is that by resource? Is it just we've just gotten to that point where it happens?
It's probably a combination of a few things. As far as resources are concerned, none of park staff are actually appointed as bylaw officers or park rangers, so we don't have the capacity to do any enforcement at all. And as a corporate resource, those resources are somewhat limited, and we do get help when they're able.
Okay, thank you. in terms of rollout then as well, and sort of with that kind of thing in mind, in the absence of an urban forester, and I learned to let things go, so I won't mention my colleagues, they voted against that in the budget. In the absence of an urban forester, how does rolling a strategy out like this occur if you don't have sort of somebody who is there to steward the overall aspect? Does it just become part of everybody else's job?
Actually, although we don't have an urban forester by title, our urban forest coordinator functions as an urban forest, as in other cities. It just doesn't have that title. So Mr. Nishikawa would be primarily responsible for coordinating this. And the primary difference is he manages the forest and his staff kind of manage the trees. So that would fall to him.
I'm sure there's a forest and trees analogy there, but I can't think of it at the moment. So thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll step out.
Thank you. Councillor Mearsharo.
You're
still muted, Councillor Mearsharo.
Well, that's even better for you guys. I just said I think more or less Councillor Kaufman asked the questions that I had questions. So thank you. I just want to comment that I love that your committee that developed the plan was multi-dimensional, multi-departmental. It makes a lot of sense to include all those people. So good job all around.
Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just sort of one final question around sort of the holistic approach to this. I do recall when we had the conversation around the was it the Emerald Ash Borer? A number of years ago, we had an invasive bug coming into the community. One of the things that were addressed, and I haven't seen sign that it's moving ahead, is on the issue of preservation. When we're talking about route identification, route maintenance, when one of our construction units or a contractor is going into a public area to cut something up, there doesn't seem to be any sort of identification of where roots are coming from trees, where at least they can be identified. There was some conversation at the time. I believe Mr. Ellis, you had said that would be something that staff would certainly be looking into. I didn't see recognition of that in the document. It's possible I missed it, but I didn't see recognition of sort of this. We'll go out and we'll look. I can use the example that I watched an electric crew replace a telephone pole. Amazing job, very technical, very dangerous, and they did a wonderful job with it. But it did involve disturbing roots to an established tree. There was no marking, there was no identification. I recognize they've got to get the pole in, but that type of work didn't appear to be done, at least from my outward assessment. And it's not really addressed in here. You know, when Councillor Miyashiro credits it being a cross expertise group that got together, that was awesome. But where do we work that into policy as well? Where if a crew is going out to dig up something that requires replacement, where do we acknowledge that there's a living organism within that, and just an identification or protection of the fundamental support of that organism?
Thank you, and through the chairman. This is one of the advantages of being involved or a member of the Infrastructure Services Department or division, is we are in close contact with our colleagues who generally do that kind of work. This is also one of the reasons why we do a cross-departmental task force or stakeholder group, so that we're able to communicate a little more frequently and deliberately on maybe techniques and methods and importance of being as careful as we can around trees.
So something you're working towards?
Something, for sure.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. One of the things that I found fascinating, and I know I had conversations with people on social media about it last night, is how very dependent we are in this community on those 4 types of trees. If it wasn't for ash, elm, poplar, and spruce, which we always call pine in Lethbridge because we can't tell our pines from spruces, but which are spruce. We have such a high dependence on those 4 types of trees, and 2 of them, at least, the ash and the elm, have dangers to them. So what does this plan do for making sure, or looking at making sure we diversify our trees going forward? and for protecting those four main types of trees?
We have been and will continue with more exuberance, I guess, explore other options. So we experiment with trees as much as we can. We're talking about partnering with a nursery association to develop maybe fringe trees that are more hardy for the prairies, and we'll continue on with that. So it's a very deliberate thing, but it is a slow thing because it takes years and years and years for that to happen, and there's trial and error. I mean, we lose some trees that just don't work.
So right now, one of our main things is protecting the forest we have, which is being aware of which dangers are coming, having resources for those. I know at the last budget, well, several budgets ago, the conversation around the ash borer war, which I think we're still prepared for if that ever comes. So one of the things you mentioned in the plan is having a reserve so that when our trees are in danger, the finances are there. How high is that up on the priority?
We are scheduled to make a presentation to this committee next month on Dutch elm disease, and we'll address some of our action plan for that. Emerald ash borer is still on the doorstep, and that's actually what we were most concerned with 3 years ago, but Dutch elm disease got here first. So we'll be updating the committee on that next month, but it is very high on our priority list. I mean, we're not proud of the fact that we're the only province or only municipality in Alberta to have Dutch elm disease first after years and years of trying to keep it out. So.
And my last question is, we're talking, of course, about the city-owned trees here. But the question we get more than anything, because we have amazing management of city-owned trees. People are concerned about how their neighbors manage their trees, or they want information on how they should manage their own tree. Is there anything in this plan that, for the general public? How does that education occur? Should it occur? Because those are the questions we're going to be asked. Whenever there comes an urban forest management plan, they're going to think it applies to everybody. So if you could just talk a little bit about what this specifically covers, and if there's any plans for working with the public.
Yeah, thank you. The plan does address and suggests a community stakeholder group or a community advisory committee, if you will, and that committee would assist us in spreading the word and education and helping people understand the challenges that trees and the forest face in the city and work more cooperatively to manage it as a resource. So that is one way we can do that. The other way we can do that is through just direct public education.
Are we going to have Arbor Day back again where we all get a tree to go plant?
I'm not sure on the history of that. I haven't been here long enough. I've been involved in lots of Arbor Days, and I was privileged to participate in Arbor Days with Grant McEwen more than a few times, and that was a privilege. So I do miss those as well.
A day off school to go plant a tree, I don't think anybody ever minded that. All right. Thank you, Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a question about strategy in terms of sort of legislative preservation. The City of Calgary, I know, has an urban canopy bylaw, which deals with the obviously the public trees and the situation that I addressed earlier, where it does, as we've done here, puts a value on trees. So if you want to take it out, it's going to cost you. The strategy that's being proposed by the consultant is to actually incorporate protection in the MDP. Would there not be a greater wisdom of having a separate bylaw that can be more encompassing, as opposed to creating the provision for discretionary use, things of that nature, wiggle room around some of these things, especially when it's more general, based on based on a zone, as opposed to an area of the city?
I believe you're right. The more specific the direction or the bylaw or the program, the more effective it would be. I believe the reference to the MDP was to incorporate the importance of trees at the higher level, but certainly the need to have specific bylaws and policies would definitely be more effective, in my opinion.
Yeah, sorry. Good MDP, good, it's in there. Sorry, I should have said land use bylaw, because there's reference to putting it in the land use bylaw where now you get into the discretionary. Now you've got it in specific zones as opposed to talking about the tree perhaps more holistically and creating the opportunity for targeted if we have to. And I think a more of an across the board approach as opposed to there's ways you can get around the land use bylaw. I don't know if I should ever say that publicly or not, but there are ways.
And those are the kinds of discussions we'd hope to tackle initially in the cross corporation kind of committee. Is how can we accomplish that? How can we accomplish the goals together? And what's the best tools to do that?
Okay, thank you. Final question on that cross corporation. Are you having a member of council on the committee?
We certainly.
You don't have to answer that right now. I'll just throw that out there. Thank you, Madam Chair.
One of the things that is open under heritage designation is you can designate landscape. You can designate an area that has value. Has that been considered at all in these conversations? If there is, a certain forested area in Lethbridge that is a particular value, have we thought at all about designating it as a heritage landscape, and then you could get it into a different level of protection? Has that been considered?
That's interesting. No, I don't believe we've ever had that discussion.
It's not done very often, but it is a tool that could be used if something is considered worthy enough to be considered.
We do have a number of trees listed in a provincial publication on heritage trees, but the designation doesn't accompany that. It's just recognition.
Yeah, and I know the Heritage Tree Program has restarted, and they're looking at recreating the database, etc. So I'm assuming you guys will be partnering with that. But there is that one more step up that could be done.
That's a good idea. We'll look into that.
Are there any other questions from members of the SPC or any members of council who are here? All right, I don't see any hands up. So the recommended motion before us is to receive this as a guiding document and recommend to council that it be approved to provide guidance moving ahead. So that is what we have. And again, we can use that motion. We can amend the motion. We can change as we need to. And if we do recommend it forward, we can send it to the consent agenda submission or presentation. What is the consensus, or what is the feeling of SPC at this time? Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will happily sponsor that motion, and my suggestion on this particular one would be submission.
Submission, okay. Councillor Miyashiro?
Yeah, I would agree. Submission would be fine.
Okay, so submission and recommending forward. Councillor Parker, are you in agreement with the other two?
I see no problem with that at all. Thank you.
All right. So by consensus, we will forward this on as a recommendation to council that it be approved, and we will request that it be a submission. And I'm assuming this one is no hurry. We can take this one to the next agenda review committee instead of throwing it over the wall for tomorrow.
I'll just maybe I can jump in, Madam Chair. Yeah. I think subject to some input from Mr. Westerson, I don't see any reason why we couldn't have that submission on the May 18th.
Okay.
Agenda. So.
Okay, we'll take it to tomorrow's agenda review committee, and then it will be brought forward, and that's their decision if they take it. Perfect. All right. So thank you very much. Like I said, I know I had some great conversations with people on social media. Our trees are a beloved part of our community. And thank you all not only for this presentation, but for the work you do in maintaining that urban forest. It is greatly appreciated. And we will move now to 4.3. Mr. Witkowski is going to talk to us about the Parks KPMG recommendation status update. Mr. Witkowski, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, members of the Civic Works SPC. I'm here to talk to you today about the Parks recommendations from the KPMG Fiscal and Operational Review. Next slide, please. In the KPMG report, they identified 4 recommendations for parks. Reduced grass maintenance and naturalization of parkland were identified as the 2 highest priority recommendations from administration. So that's what we've been focusing on for the last few months, and that's what my update will be on today. Next slide, please. I'll start with reduced grass maintenance. This one is a little bit straightforward. Right now we have 414 hectares of turf that we mow in the city, and we mow that on a weekly basis. And we do string trimming on a bi-weekly basis. So every other week, we are getting into each of those parks and doing some string trimming. Through our proposed reduced maintenance, we would take 178 hectares of that turf, and we would convert it to bi-weekly mowing. The KPMG report recommends that we take certain park classifications, which are listed in the green table on the bottom of that slide. They had recommended we take a certain percentage of each of those park classifications and then divvy up the parks that way between weekly and bi-weekly. However, as we started to get into the weeds of this planning, that was becoming a little problematic in terms of just transparency and just operational efficiency. How do we mobilize crews to different parks? So we decided to just make it 100% classification, either a whole park classification is weekly or it's bi-weekly. When we did that, we ended up with 178 hectares that go to bi-weekly. KPMG report recommends 185 hectares through their formula, so we're right there on target. We're meeting what they had recommended, and it just seems to us a little bit cleaner of an approach on that. The trimming will go to an every second mowing cycle. So as opposed now to doing string trimming every other week, the parks that are still on a weekly mowing will stay on an every other week. Those that go to a bi-weekly mowing, trimming will go to a once a month service. So we will see a bit of a service level change in that regard. Fertilization and aeration right now happen triannually. Every 3 years we do that. There's no recommended changes to that service, as those are critical to long-term turf health and care. Next slide, please. This is just a map just showing which ones would go to bi-weekly, which ones will stay weekly. It's just a graphic representation to help visualize the new service a little bit better. I won't spend much time on this or any time at all. We can move on to the next slide, please. So when we come to annual cost savings, we do differentiate from the KPMG report a bit. KPMG has said we can have about a $406,000 savings if we go to this reduced turf maintenance. They didn't really get into a lot of detail as to how they got to that number. So we've had to make a few assumptions on how they got to it and then compare it to some of the numbers that we have. The biggest cost difference that you'll see on there is in the irrigation. It appears that they took the overall irrigation budget, assumed if we reduced irrigation practice by a certain percentage, that would just directly relate to a reduction in budget. Doesn't quite work that way. A significant portion of our irrigation budget is through maintenance and repairs, and those things are going to continue on whether we reduce irrigation or whether we keep at our standard practice. Also with our water cost, which is really where the direct cost comes into play here, we pay an annual fixed cost for water. Our water is not metered, it's not measured. So with that annual fixed cost, we wouldn't see a reduction if we go to an operational reduction or not. Now, there is an environmental savings if we cut back on the water, but we're not going to see a financial savings on that side. By going to the bi-weekly mowing, we essentially reduce by 3 mowers, which averages out to about 90 hours of mowing per week. And then we reduce trimmers by 5. So we go from 12 trimmers from 2019 down to 7 moving forward. And a lot of these cost savings will be achieved through the 2020 November 2020 budget reduction. We are doing some of the trimming reductions this year. And a little bit of the mowing. We're not going to bi-weekly this year, not yet, pending the outcome of today, I guess. But we will see a little bit of an impact in the mowing through the budget reduction. So we will start to see some of that savings. Next slide, please. So naturalization of parkland. This one is not quite as straightforward as the turf maintenance. KPMG recommends we convert 98 hectares of irrigated turf over to naturalized space, and they recommend we do it over a 2-year conversion period. They had suggested we could do this conversion for an investment of $250,000, with another investment of $100,000 in communication costs, with an annual savings of $333,000. As we started to really get into the details of this recommendation, we're finding that to find 98 hectares of existing space to convert over is really starting to impact the functional recreational space in some of the parks. And I'll get into a little more detail on some of these in the next few slides. Also, the cost, we had met with a few contractors, did some research. We're looking at about a minimum of $1.5 million to convert over 98 hectares. Really, we're probably looking in the $2 to $4 million range. And again, I'll go into this in a little more detail coming up. The good news, we don't need to spend $100,000 on communication. We can do a pretty robust communication plan for $5,000. So obviously with these numbers, we're looking at a much longer term cost recovery than I think what the report shows. Naturalized parks, some other things to consider, naturalized parks will be brown, and we could receive some public criticism as we have on past projects when we try to do some efforts like this. Next slide, please. So when we talk about naturalization, first thing we have to do is define what is naturalization. And before we can define what it is, we have to define what it is not. In Lethbridge, it is not just the abandonment of existing turf maintenance. We don't have the precipitation here to just walk away from turf and still have it look vibrant and healthy. If we just walked away from irrigated turf right now, it would be weedy, it would brown out, we would probably get rodents in there. It just would not look attractive. So we have to do something with it. And these are some different options that we have. There isn't one of these that is there's a blanket fix. Depending on what part of the city we chose to do, we would probably incorporate a little bit of all 5 of these on here, and maybe there's even some other options still. And that's where the cost comes into play, because we can't just leave a site. We have to go convert it. We actually have to come in, remove the existing turf, and then plant some of these other options. With all the mobilization around the site, that's where we start to see some of that cost impact. Next slide, please. So with all these challenges, we are recommending still doing some naturalization, but maybe taking a little bit of a different model than what the KPMG report had recommended. Right now, we have about 40 hectares of land that we have identified that could be converted over to naturalization without impacting really any functional space, any recreational space. They're kind of some smaller green strips, some roadside buffers. So we have about 40, and we could probably, push that between that 30 and 50 range, and still be comfortable on that conversion. And I want to jump down to the last bullet. So what we're proposing is we go back and do some conversion, but let's go talk to the development industry about new parks coming on being more naturalized and trying to work with the development industry in that regard. We have the option of possibly incentivizing it through a revision in our cost share arrangement with the developers. And that will help us move forward with this and kind of set a new strategy, a new standard. Now, the savings to the city will be longer term. We would be looking at probably 5+ years before we really start to see any kind of return on that. But there's not as much upfront cost, and it'll help with growth too as we start to take on more parks and have more maintenance pressures. Just quickly, the other 2 bullets, public consultation is a very key component to this. We would like to do a public consultation, public engagement program. We did reach out to other municipalities in Alberta who have done this. Every one of them recommended, first thing they said, go consult with the public. You'll get much less pushback if you engage with the public before you do this and if you just try to go out and do something. We also have a partnership going right now with the University of Lethbridge. There is one student in particular who is looking at doing just this, who wants to look at some naturalized areas in Lethbridge. So we have met with her. We're in the process of identifying about 4 small sites throughout the city. It'll be a small cost to the city. We can help her set those up. She will monitor, she will create the reports. and we'll kind of work with her on that. So I think it's a pretty good program. Now, this is still about a 3-year program, so it's not going to happen instantly, but it does give us the option to kind of look how naturalization can work in the city. Next slide, please. For sake of time, I'm just going to go through these real quick. I just identified some potential risks for each one. I'm not going to go through these. I'm sure you've looked at them already through your packet. Next slide, please. Same with the communications plan. We did meet with the communications department already, so we do have a strategy ready to go. We're ready to implement these. Again, I'm not going to list them all off, but they're right here for your reference. And then last slide, please. So just for some next steps, like I said, we would like to do public engagement, not just for naturalization, also for the reduced grass maintenance. It will be a pretty big service change, so it might be worth talking to the public. We'd like to do a community survey. I do believe transportation is also doing one on their snow removal, I think it is. So we've already talked to transportation about trying to combine those efforts and doing one larger community engagement event instead of just each individual department going out and sending out a bunch of surveys. So we're already started those talks. And then with some other projects or some other work, we would like to come back to Civic Works SPC, most likely be after the election, probably December or early December early 2022, which is to report back on what we found and maybe a final recommendation moving forward. That's it for that right now. I will open it up for questions, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for the presentation. Are there any questions from members of council or committee? Councillor Miyashiro.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for the presentation. It was very informative. I think one of the things that I appreciate you did was identify that naturalization isn't just the fact that you let things go wild. And that's a really important distinction, but that people really need to understand in your communication is naturalization doesn't mean just let things go wild. I live in Legacy Ridge, and I can see some really great use of naturalization in several areas around storm ponds and around areas that are bordering on the coulees. When you talk about reducing the size of green strips, I know along the one path, the green grass is about 3 feet at the most, maybe 2 feet, and then the rest is longer prairie grass. So I appreciate the effort that your department has done. In your communication plan, is that something that you really want to? Is that something that you're really going to focus on a lot, though? What is about the naturalization part, aside from all the other savings, is that going to be a real focus for your education so people really understand what that means?
Yeah, we did focus our communication plan. We focused a little more on the naturalization than we did on the reduced maintenance because there's a little more that goes into it. A lot of the education piece, why are we doing this? What are the benefits of naturalization? You know, it's more than just a cost savings measure, and it even is a little bit more of an operational measure. So we really want to get into the benefits of it. You know, aside from just the standard social media posts, we are looking at doing signage, especially in the specific areas that we're going to convert over. Also doing some videos, some different kind of messaging to help with that education.
Great. Great, thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from members of the SPC? I don't see any hands up. Certainly, we know if you were to go ahead without talking to the public, we'd be the first to find out any changes you've made, because we'd be getting those phone calls very quickly. Because you're right, the community very much cares about their parks, and if something seems to not be getting maintained, the phone calls come fast and furious. So the public consultation is absolutely essential, and I appreciate that you understand that as well. But it is something that's very nice to see as we move ahead. So what we have today is this is before us for information, and so we would just receive it. It does not move on to council. So if there are no questions from any other members of SPC, is everyone in agreement on moving that as the motion that we receive this as information?
Yes.
Since you've already heard it, you can't get back the information anyways. So thank you very much, Mr. Witkowski, for the presentation and for the work you're doing on this. It is very much appreciated. So we will move now to item 4.4, We'll be leaving behind parks and heading to the electric department. Mr. Burns Hill, the electric distribution design manager, will be talking about the electric department asset management project update. So, Mr. Hill, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for the committee for your time for me to come here. So I'll be giving an update on some of our KPMG initiatives that we have going forward. So next slide, please. So in the report, there are some opportunities that were outlined. One of the statements they made were there may be an opportunity for the Lethbridge Electric Utility to employ asset management practices across all asset types to help the utility manage its investment in capital assets and control rate growth. So they felt it important that we kind of engage in more formal asset management practices in for planning for capital assets. So next slide, please. So they said in the report, LEU has historically made asset replacement decisions based on asset age, failure, or suspected condition. This could result in assets being replaced prematurely, resulting in higher rates. So the utilities never really had a formal asset management plan per se. We worked off of a number of criteria to determine where we would place our capital spending. Some of that had to do with growth and pressures to update and upgrade systems. And some of it was just based on failure. Some of it was based upon linemen patrolling and giving feedback on what areas just don't look very good. But we didn't have a formal asset management plan. So next slide, please. So they said in the report, asset management practices could improve internal capabilities to deliver services in an effective and efficient way, resulting in greater value for money from cities' infrastructure. So they suggested this could be a tool that we could use to better control where we place our money and how our spending takes place, so that we can hit the most important areas first. Next slide, please. So another point that they brought up, another initiative, was sustainable growth. So they said there may be an opportunity to improve the utility's capital planning process to target a more sustainable growth rate. It may be possible to minimize large increases in rate base by refining the utility's long-term financial planning model to calculate a sustainable growth rate for assets based on an upper target for rate increases. So they felt it important for us to analyze our spending and make sure that we are that we have a target for our spending, so that we don't have rate increases that are too substantial. So we began to look at that as well. So next slide, please. And we just found that these two, the asset management and sustainable growth initiatives, were pretty closely tied. And they kind of work on the same capital spending and how the utility spends money and how much. So we gathered these and put them together into one strategy. Next slide. So just to give a little bit of background on our assets. So currently we track close to $500 million in assets, and we do it in just over 20 categories of assets, from poles to lines to transformers to a number of things. We have 46 kilometers of transmission line. That's high voltage bulk power coming into our substations. 152 kilometers of overhead distribution lines. So these are the smaller lines that to go into the city to feed businesses and homes. 826 kilometers of underground distribution lines that we can't see, that tend to pose a bit of a challenge. If you can't see it, it's hard to know what it's doing. So we have quite a bit of work there, and 1,633 kilometers of secondary cables. So this would be a cable dedicated to one house or one business, and then close to 5,000 transformers. So next slide, please. So when we started to look at these initiatives, we gathered together some people in our utility. We started to do research to find out what other utilities do, even what other departments do within the city. We contacted consultants, got some ideas of what possibilities there are out in industry, and of course we came across a wide range of ideas, lots of expensive software, and various things that people would propose that we do. Ultimately, we decided that the most cost-effective way and streamline is to fall in line with what other city departments are doing and use our existing systems, more simplified. There's a whole range of software that you can get that dynamically looks at the assets and comes up with values based upon work orders and lots of inputs, but we're going to do more of a manual approach. And we'll be using existing software with no further investment in that respect. So next slide, please. So our data systems group that monitors our assets through the computer systems and software, we've come up with 9 additional fields to our database that we are implementing that will help us with this management program. So I'm just going to go through these really quick so you can kind of see what we're doing here. So next slide, please. So the first one is install date. We currently store that data in a lot of our assets, but we don't have that history on a number of assets for various reasons. We used to work on paper copies of our assets. When we transferred from paper to digital, some of that information was lost or was never there. And so we have a date, and some of those dates are all the same. So we might get into some areas, and the date turns out to be the date it was put into the computer. So we don't have that date. So members of the utility, we're going to best identify the period from various other clues and data sources on when assets were actually installed in the system. We're currently about 80% complete this process. Next slide, please. Number 2 is asset life. So based upon our experience with our linemen and with our engineers on our climate and our winters and all these things, combined with what the manufacturer rates, the equipment, we'll be giving our assets an expected lifespan in years. Of course, this is expected, and every area is different. You know, with transformers that sit on the edge of a highway, they get a lot of salt, and so the lifespan of those transformers is obviously less than somewhere else. So we have to take some of these things into account. So this value combined with the install date will give an anticipated remaining life of the equipment. And we currently have a draft document that we're about to finalize in the next month that will give us our best indication of what an asset life would be. Next slide, please. So the third one is run to failure. So this value will be a Boolean or just a simple yes or no, indicating if this type of asset is in service until it fails, or if it's replaced prior to failure. And of course, some people at first glance this sounds a bit irresponsible to run something to failure, but it's a very common utility practice and method to track assets that just are too numerous and don't pose as significant a risk. Example would be just a small cable that feeds the light in a bus shelter. There are many kilometers of that, and we can't track them, can't see them, and so if they fail, it's just a matter of going to fixing them. So we don't spend a lot of effort sitting around the table trying to figure out when we're going to replace a bus feed cable. We just wait for failure on some of those things. So we have a number of assets that would be run to failure. Next slide, please. Number 4 would be asset condition. So we'd assign an asset to value between 1 and 5. Like a new asset would be given a 1, and then it goes all the way to old with 5 categories. With those are the likelihood of failure. So we have new, good, intermediate, poor, and old. So that'll allow us to give some condition there. So next slide, please. And this is the most difficult data to collect. So we have to visit every asset on a regular basis. And give it an equal assessment compared to others. So this is going to be the most difficult thing to maintain, and the most challenging and time intensive. So this data, we won't be able to fully populate all of this data till at least next year. And we're about 20% complete that process, and that's an ongoing thing for us to be doing. Next slide, please. So the fifth category we have is asset risk. So we're going to give assets value between 1 and 5, indicating the amount of damage or the effect on the system this have when it fails. So from low risk to high risk, 1 to 5. So again, like a bus shelter cable has very low risk to affect the system versus a power transformer or substation that feeds 30% of the city. Obviously is very different in terms of the risk it poses for failure. So we're going to go through and assess that and assign those values to each asset. Next slide. So we have impact to failure. So the values of asset condition and asset risk are multiplied together to provide an impact value, and that'll be between 1 and 25. This will break everything into 4 categories: low, moderate, high, and extreme. So this will allow us to see the assets that are most likely to affect our system. Next slide, please. This shows a chart of these categories. Green is low impact, and of course red is high. So if you have something that's in bad condition and has high impact, it's extreme. So this will give us a tool that we can use to see areas, and we can even project this onto maps to see which areas in the city are red and where we should be focusing our attention for spending. Next slide, please. So this is inspection date. So this is a date indicating the time the asset was last inspected. And that'll be in our regular patrols. We'll just be marking down which date it was we looked at it. And of course, run to fail assets are not assigned an inspection date. Next slide. Inspection frequency. So this tells us how long it should be before we visit our asset since the last time. So it allows us to set cycles and patrol schedules, define work levels for inspection. Next slide, please. And number 9 is our replacement cost. So this is a dollar value to replace an asset. And we did something kind of unique here and very interesting. Our data systems group was able to generate an algorithm that uses previous work orders over the last year or two to determine the average cost of an asset based upon actual costs that come in. So this calculation is done multiple times to get an average, and combined with asset age and risk, it gives an indication of the capital work that's coming up. And this is already implemented. This algorithm is running and 100% complete, and it gives us a good indication of what it would cost to replace an asset. So next slide, please. So our schedule, various members of the utility will be working on this and identifying the data that needs to be populated, going through and coming up with our best understanding of how old assets are. We're going to be doing training on how the tool is going to be implemented and used, and the analysis methods. And we anticipate we'll be moving from implementation to maintenance of Q4 this year. So hopefully we'll get to a better place by the end of this year and be able to use this tool for our capital spending. Next slide, please. And as far as the spending caps, we've actually been working on that for a couple of years previous. We're always fine-tuning that. And we've already had a spending cap set and worked into our budgets and our capital spending to achieve that sustainable growth. Next slide. And I think that's the end of the presentation. So if you have any more questions.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Does any member of the SBC have questions? I don't see any hands up. I have one, and I may be out to lunch on this, but I know when it comes to certain things that need, maintenance, the community lets us know when things are in trouble. Potholes come to mind. Like, trust me, I get emails about potholes, and I'm sure Mr. Hawkins does as well. Sidewalks, people will let us know there's a sidewalk in my neighborhood that needs something. And in a way, it's great. It's like we crowdsource our asset management because the community lets us know what is in trouble. Is there any way that can be built into this? If you see an issue, or is it so specific that your department is the ones who would recognize the issues? Right? Is there a way that the community can support us in this?
Well, we have 311. Sometimes it's hard for the public to identify what's a problem. Obviously, if you're seeing the great blue light, then there's a problem, and those typically get relayed pretty fast. Sometimes if there's a wire hanging, we get lots of calls, only to find out that it's actually a TELUS or a Shaw or a communication cable. So sometimes it's difficult for the public to know what they're looking at, but typically we work through 311 and to getting calls directly from the public.
So that is another way that you'll get feedback on any concerns is from the public, and that ties in with, we're not going to be as educated as you about whether or not it really needs it, but we could communicate with your department through 311 if there are concerns.
Yeah, we have the communication channel set up through 311. Common questions that come in, we have a list of common questions for them. If there's anything that the 311 center can't answer, then they have direct numbers to subject matter experts who can help with that. So
excellent. Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you very much for the information. I actually see your utility slightly differently. When stuff happens, it happens and we all recognize it, but it's not something you're going to see happening. It's not like you're driving down a street and see water coming up underneath or things of that nature. So you do certainly something a little more unique. I had mentioned earlier in the meeting, electric crew did an excellent job replacing a phone pole. That piece of infrastructure that I'm assuming would be entered into the database, and there would be a date established with it and some other notation. That's the way the process is working, correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I should know this, and I'm realizing during the presentation that I don't. With new subdivisions we bring on board, our department is doing the work on electric, so all the subsurface infrastructure, anything that runs to connecting to a house. Is that correct?
We have a contractor that we have hired that they do a lot of the work for that.
Okay. All of that infrastructure, though, is entered into or would be entered into an asset management database at that time, correct? It doesn't come on board when we take over the subdivision in 2 or 3 years, correct?
No, yeah, we have pretty specific information on anything new. It's just a lot of the old stuff when it was paper that we were working off of that we run into troubles. But anything new, yeah, we have all the necessary information.
Okay, thank you. Final question. One of the things I noticed that you didn't really address was the issue of redundancy. I know Mr. Hawkins has talked about that in terms of water delivery systems and some other things. Do we have that with electric as well, that we've got some redundancy? Does that have an impact or an effect on asset management as well?
Yeah, we actually have a very good redundancy built into our system. We have typically on every location in the city, we have two places of feed that we can come from. So if one fails, we can come from the other direction. So we're always trying to maintain that and grow that. There are some areas that we call radial, and that just refers to there's only one cable going in, and if that cable fails, then it's a significant outage. So when we identify those wherever possible, we try to get a loop system, which means there's another feed direction. So we have really good redundancy in our system.
Okay. Does that impact asset management, though?
It does. I mean, we take that into account. If typically both directions are the same age, and so the same risk exists, but there might be occasionally where we have one feed is new, so it's not as big a risk. We may not necessarily need to replace that second direction of feed right away. These are all factors we have to take into account.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So this is a big project. This is coming out of KPMG. This is a lot of stuff that you're working on. The end result and what you're looking for is it will actually increase customer satisfaction because you'll have better maintenance and outages would hopefully be reduced. Cost benefit analysis. Is this something that is going to have a immediate impact on the community? Is it worth the time and effort that you're doing to get there? Because I know this came from KPMG. It was something that was recommended. Is this going to be helpful in the end for the work you're doing?
I believe in the end it will be helpful. In the immediate term, the public won't see, it's not going to affect rates because there's a lot of work to do. We're going to continue spending money. We're going to continue doing maintenance. It's just how we kind of target that. And over time, as the report says, we may be replacing some assets too early right now. So we might be able to stretch that money over time, and down the road we'll see the benefit, but the public won't see anything immediately.
So it will be worth it, even though there's a lot of work ahead.
That's right, yeah.
Okay. Councillor Parker.
Thanks, Mr. Hill, for your presentation. And my question is either yourself or Mr. Hawkins. So this is a presentation. You don't need any direction from council at all, or even this committee. This is just information for us to know that what's happened through the KPMG, but there's really no direction needed from us or the council as a whole. Am I correct?
That's right. Yeah, this is information. Sorry, Doug. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, this is just to demonstrate that to the extent that we made an investment in KPMG, that we are taking some of their opportunity identifications very seriously, and in this case, we are acting on specifically 2 recommendations that came out of that, and we wanted to make sure that council through the committee understands that we're making this a priority, and we are making progress in terms of advancing those opportunities.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Are there any other questions from members of the SPC? I don't see anybody's hands up, so that does get us to our recommended action. This is a project update and for information purposes only. So unless anyone has any concerns about that, I assume by consensus we're all okay with accepting this as a report for information. Thank you very much, Mr. Hill, and thank you to your team for all the work that's gone into this and for the work ahead of you. This will be, as you said, will be advantageous moving ahead, but there is a lot to be done on it, I'm sure. Thank you for that. All right, that brings us to the end of the presentations on the agenda. There were no submissions, so we have no submissions before us and no confidential items. Is there anything any member of SPC, as next meeting of course is in June, is there anything burning on your mind that you're like, is this going to be on the next agenda or anything that you just want to have a sense about? Councillor Kaufman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And at the risk of being ruled out of order in terms of agenda items, this is just a question about process. I know it's been stated at several SPCs that putting things in a consent agenda could be a bit of a challenge, or is developing to be a bit of a challenge. And there was talk about possibly creating a new section on regular agenda for council dealing with SPC issues. I know that you are currently acting mayor, is that correct?
I am.
So you'll be at the meeting tomorrow. Would you be able just to find out so that these items could actually just end up being under SPC as opposed to having to necessarily designate where things go?
Kate, Mr. Westerson, will you pass it on to the city clerk's office as well so that my memory has your memory to help me out with it?
Certainly.
Okay, maybe if 2 of us have it in our minds, we'll actually remember to take it to the meeting tomorrow.
I can raise it again next month when we've all forgotten, so thank you.
I'm hoping I can remember for the next 20 hours, but we'll see. But yes, I remember we had that discussion, and that would be much more apparent to the public as well, that consent agenda is supposed to just be routine stuff. If there's a separate SPC thing under the agenda, they'll know to take a better look at it if they have any questions what SPCs are doing. So certainly I think that would be a much more appropriate way of doing it. Is there anything else any members of SPC would like to see either on the next agenda, something that we could suggest to Mr. Hawkins and his team coming forward at some point? Remember that the June meeting is going to be the last SPC meeting for Civic Works until September, because we would take a break in July and August unless we call a special meeting. So if you have burning issues, you need to get it forward for the June meeting. All right, not seeing any hands up or any concern, I will, by consensus, adjourn us. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody, and I will see you all either tomorrow at meetings or Monday at meetings.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thanks again, Mr. Westerson, for your help, and thank you for everybody who presented tonight.